the years to come.
That ends questions to the Health and Wellbeing portfolio. We now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number S4M 06475 in the name of Hugh Henry on childcare. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. Can I remind all members that this debate and the next debate is quite heavily subscribed to, therefore time is tight and we will keep you very tightly to your time. I call on Hugh Henry to speak to move the motion. Mr Henry, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name. For many hard-working Scottish families, affordable, good quality and flexible childcare has become an absolute necessity for their economic well-being. For some families, the absence of such childcare means that they are unable to take up employment, and even worse in some cases, they have had to give up work because they couldn't afford the childcare on offer, or else it wasn't available locally. In its report, Making Work Pay, the Childcare Trap, Save the Children said that high childcare costs are affecting parents' ability to work, train and study in Scotland. 8 out of 10 parents living in severe poverty said that the cost was a barrier to accessing childcare. The report also said that parents in severe poverty have cut back on essentials such as food and household bills simply to pay for childcare. The report also said that the high cost of childcare means that work is not paying for the poorest families. Now, I am sure I am not alone in saying that for some parents the childcare costs are actually higher than their housing costs. The Daycare Trust Childcare Survey in 2012 paints a sombre picture. It reported 44,000 fewer families receiving help with childcare costs since the tax credit cut in April of that year. And the survey also reported that average childcare costs now exceed £100 for a part-time place, that's 25 hours, in many parts of Britain, with the average yearly expenditure for a child under 2 starting at £5,103 per year. And the call for good quality, affordable childcare is essential not just to the personal well-being in families, but to the economic well-being of our country. There is no doubt that the introduction of universal entitlement to free nursery education by the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition transformed the lives of many families, but it also marked a revolution in the way in which we educate our young children. In 2007, both Labour and the SNP promised to extend the number of available hours, and the Children and Young People Bill Scotland will finally deliver on this 7 years later. Now, this debate is not about the bill, but I do want to make a few comments in the passing. The extension of hours will no doubt be warmly welcomed by families across Scotland, as will the introduction of flexibility. But we should not confuse education with childcare, nor suggest that childcare is a substitute for education. And for very young children, early childhood education and childcare are inseparable, but they are not indivisible. When you educate a young child, you also have to care for that child. And we should not, when we seek to meet the legitimate childcare demands of parents, abandon the progress which we have made in early years education. To do so, I would argue, risks widening the educational attainment gap and would risk Scottish education being set back 40 years or more, certainly.
Sorry, Minister. And education not being indivisible, and that's why the commitment is to increase 600 hours of early learning and childcare, taking on board that point that Hugh Henry makes. Hugh Henry?
I think perhaps the Minister has failed to understand what I'm saying, is that because they are not indivisible, we should not substitute one with the other, and the welcome extension to 600 hours should be about extending the education and not necessarily the childcare. But we can have that debate at another time, because I would argue that early education is planned as any teacher would do. It has to be focused on the progressive development of the child, and it cannot be ad hoc. The staff involved must have an advanced knowledge of child development. On the other hand, childcare can be the physical and social care of the child, or even the leisure of the child, as happens in many excellent out-of-school care projects. They are certainly caring for the child, but they are not necessarily educating the child. So it's disappointing that the Scottish Government amendment tries to suggest that the bill is some sort of answer to the childcare problems facing families across Scotland. It carries the danger of diminishing early years educational input and substituting it with childcare. But we also need to remember that the focus of the bill is on 3- and 4-year-olds. The bill will do little, if anything, for children under 3 and nothing at all for those aged 5 and upwards. The childcare needs of Scottish families starts at birth and goes up to the age of 14, and on this the amendment is strangely silent. Even the reference to the work of the Early Years Task Force is only about the early years, and it's disappointing that the Scottish Government amendment has nothing to say about the wider childcare needs of Scottish families. These families need help at the end of the school day and sometimes before the school day begins. They need help on in-service days and school holidays, and given the demands on many women working in retail, they may also need help into the evening as well. I spoke recently to a number of Usdaw shop stewards, and they reported real pressures on women being asked to change shift patterns or work extended hours for a temporary period, which can sometimes cause a childcare crisis. Not every family has 2 parents to share the load. In some families, both parents have to work. Not everyone has an available and willing extended family to take some of the pressures of childcare. So when we talk about a comprehensive childcare strategy, we need one which looks at birth to 14 and doesn't just talk about the early years. We need a strategy which is flexible to meet the needs of families, but which is also affordable. And above all, any extended childcare must be underpinned with quality and high standards and be subject to rigorous scrutiny and rules. We cannot afford to gamble with the well-being of our children just to save money.
To point out to the member that one of the subgroups within the Early Years Task Force is looking at early learning and childcare for all, so hopefully that will be welcomed by the member.
Hugh Henry.
But again, Minister, you fail to understand even the words that you use, early learning and childcare for all. What I'm saying is that childcare goes up to the age of 14. We are not just talking about early years. Now, I realise that the delivery of such a service will present challenges in terms of both the finance and physical capacity. If there was an easy solution, it would have been presented long before now. And that's why Scottish Labour is proposing a Scottish Childcare Commission, which I would have hoped would have all-party support. And something like this, which is so essential for hard-working families, we need to set aside our political differences and to come up with a sustainable proposal which will actually make a real difference to these Scottish families. Politicians need to engage with experts in early childhood education. That I accept, but also with those who have expertise in the delivery of childcare and the knowledge and understanding of working with children. We need to engage with those who have a responsibility for delivery. And we should not be too big to admit that individually we don't have all the answers, or that there are others who might know better. And we do need to engage with those who know what they are talking about. And above all, we need to work out how much this would cost and where the money would come from. And that's why Joanne Lamont has offered to work with the First Minister. But I don't think that that offer should be restricted to just the SNP and to Scottish Labour. There are practical things that we can do now if there is a will across the political spectrum. We do not need to wait until 2014 or 2016. But I accept that if we are to make a long-term difference, then we need to start working together now and not delay while Scottish families struggle. And I don't mean any disrespect to the Council of Economic Advisers when I say that I don't think that they are best placed to come up with a practical model of comprehensive childcare delivery. They may be noted economic experts, and I accept that financial underpinning is essential. But we need the expertise of those who educate and work with children. Presiding Officer, there is one thing that I agree with in the Scottish Government amendment, and that is that we need to look at the best models of delivery and funding for Scotland. And that's why I appeal, even at this late stage, to the Scottish Government to withdraw its amendment. Let's work together. Let's put aside our differences. Let's agree to share the knowledge and expertise from the political spectrum, but also from the professional spectrum. let's agree for once to put those party political differences aside. Let's work together to come up with affordable, flexible and quality childcare which families in Scotland want and need. Let's put families first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Aileen Campbell to speak to and move Amendment S4M 06475.1. Minister, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I want to start by welcoming the Labour motion about our plans within the Children and Young People Bill to increase the funded entitlement to early learning and childcare to a minimum of 600 hours per year. And I also welcome the desire to work across party lines on the issue of extending childcare further. And I recognise that Joanne Lamont is to meet the First Minister in the near future to discuss childcare. Now, we do all recognise that high-quality early learning and childcare has a vital role to play, both for children's social, emotional and cognitive development, and also for parents seeking to balance their childcare responsibilities with work, education or training. So it's therefore an issue with profound implications for Scotland's economy now and into the future. Our provisions within the Children and Young People Bill to increase free early learning and childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as the most vulnerable 2-year-olds, to a minimum of 600 hours per year, represents a significant step towards our longer-term aim, a transformational shift in childcare to build a high-quality, universal system of early learning and childcare, meeting the needs of all children, their parents and their families. Now, our commitment to legislate for 600 hours represents significant progress since we took office in 2007. And this progress is an important component in our committed efforts to maximise household budgets through a social wage to benefit and improve the economic and social well-being of Scottish citizens. Now, our efforts will benefit around 121,000 children with their families, including since 2007, savings equivalent to around £700 in childcare bills, adding 188 hours of free early learning and childcare, and crucially increasing flexibility to ensure high-quality early learning and childcare is delivered in response to local needs and choices for parents. This will improve consistency and lead to better outcomes for children and better meet the needs of parents, particularly those mothers who want to go back to work into education or training. We're also on a journey of improvement in provision of help and support for the most vulnerable in our society, exemplified by the extension of the childcare entitlement to 2-year-olds who are looked after and those under a kinship care order who we can prevent from becoming or remaining looked after. And we recognise that looked after children have some of the poorest outcomes in society and believe it's essential we focus our efforts where we can make real and positive difference. And I know much has been said in the Chamber about the benefits of extending the funded entitlement to a wider group of disadvantaged 2-year-olds. And I know the opposition have cited the commitment of the UK Government to extend the entitlement to the most vulnerable 40% of 2-year-olds. My reply is that this Government is absolutely committed to building a high-quality, universal system of early learning and childcare for all children to benefit the most vulnerable in our society. But we must do that in a manageable and a sustainable way, guided by the getting it right for every child approach, an approach designed to secure better outcomes for every child in our land. And failure to move forward on a manageable and a sustainable terms would compromise the quality of a provision for our youngest children. And quite frankly, Presiding Officer, the risk of adverse impacts on our youngest children is not acceptable to this Government. In England, it's becoming clear that many experts have serious doubts about the affordability, the practicality and the effectiveness of expanded the funded entitlement so far and so fast. And only yesterday, the BBC reported a potential shortage of 55,000 places for disadvantaged 2-year-olds. Naomi Eisenstadt, a respected academic and former director of the Sure Start unit in England, is visiting Scotland tomorrow, and I hope to meet with her. And Professor Cathy Nutbrown, an academic who carried out the review that informed the UK Government's More Great Childcare strategy, has now criticised that strategy. And she was recently quoted as saying, "Trading staff-to-child ratios for higher qualified staff is nonsense. Watering down ratios will threaten quality. Childcare may be cheaper, but children will be footing the bill." And this Government will not compromise on quality, and we must get this absolutely right. So to this end, the First Minister has asked the Council of Economic Advisers to look at the best models of delivery and funding for a system of childcare in an independent Scotland, informed what other countries are doing. And as I'm sure all in this chamber are aware, There are a range of models of provision and funding, but our concern at all times must be what is right for Scotland and for our people. So I'm delighted to announce today our early learning and childcare strategic funding partnerships with the National Day Nursery Association and the Care and Learning Alliance, and we have allocated £155,000 added to the £1.5 million already allocated by BIG to early learning and childcare third sector partners through the Third Sector Early Intervention Fund. Okay.
Hugh Henry.
The Minister has spoken at some length about early learning and childcare, and I welcome any additional resources to that field. But will she not accept that a debate about childcare is not just about early years? The crisis facing Scottish families is often about out-of-school care and sometimes care in the mornings. Will the Minister not accept that we actually need to work together to come up with something, or is she intending just to ignore it completely?
Minister.
I said at the outset that I would be happy to work with any party and any member who is interested in childcare, and I have made the points in my remarks about the additional money that has come through the Third Sector Early Intervention Fund, one of the recipients being the Scottish Out-of-School Care Network, who provide childcare to children beyond the early years, and recognise it is an important piece of work that we are asking these groups to take forward, and are doing so in a strategic manner through this funding, which I am sorry that Mr Henry had missed. Now, this Government has shown a strong commitment to early years since the publication of the Early Years Framework in 2008. And to step up the pace of change, the Early Years Task Force was established in 2011. And that task force brings professionals, practitioners and politicians from across the political spectrum together to inform the strategic direction of how early years policy, and to establish a consensus on how to drive the transformational change that is needed in the early years. Now, their expertise is guiding us now and is ensuring our action as early years policy and in childcare are right and based on sound and strong evidence. And we've commissioned research looking at models used in other European countries, and we'll put that to the Council of Economic Advisers to study the context and applicability to the labour market in Scotland. So, Presiding Officer, we shouldn't wait for a further commission to be established in order to work together. We are already doing a lot of work now and have made a lot of progress. And I've made clear this Government's commitment to building a high-quality universal system, meeting the needs of all children, not just in the early years, but absolutely looking at childcare needs for families across the country. And I look forward to working constructively with all parties as this Parliament debates the bill that we're bringing forward, and making sure that we can all work together to create a bill that this Parliament will be proud of and will benefit children of all ages across the land.
Thank you, Minister. And I now call on Liz Smith. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Scottish Conservatives are very happy to support the Labour motion, and I thank you, Henry, for spelling out in a little bit more detail just what is envisaged regarding the call for the Childcare Commission. I think particularly he makes a very good point about older year groups involved in that process. Notwithstanding that, time after time in this chamber, there has been proof of consensus that it is the child's earliest years that will have the most profound effect on their life chances, and the logic, therefore, is that the policy focus must be in these earliest years, something, incidentally, which I note is increasingly part of the debate for colleges and universities these days, and I think there has to be much greater attention paid to improving the outcomes at that stage. It makes sense that one important means of doing just that is to improve the provision of preschool care for our youngest children, and I use the word improve advisedly, since there is an important debate to be had about the qualitative aspects of care, just as about the availability, and it's not good enough just to increase the number of children receiving that care. We need to be sure that there are certain standards that can be upheld, and that is why I think there can be the benefits of a childcare commission, which can draw on the expertise of many professionals. There has also been a consensus in this Parliament that in recent years parents have often struggled to get access to sufficiently flexible and affordable childcare, with Scottish families paying some of the highest costs across the country. That price of childcare has soared by an average of £600 since 2005, and I think we're all very conscious of the significant disparities across the country. Some local authorities in Scotland have been charging twice as much as others for the cost of care. It is also quite clear that many parents feel that the current system of childcare provision is too inflexible, and it often fails to take into consideration the busy schedule of parents. And I think that particularly applies to some of the older children. Although I stress we have to be very careful indeed to balance this with what are the social and educational interests of the child. We must be sure that any extended system is able to combine both interests and not compromise either. For example, allowing parents to take up their entitlement in hours out with those presently on offer might be convenient for working parents, but perhaps less beneficial to the educational and social development of the child. That's a significant problem for families across Scotland. A report from Children in Scotland called the Scottish Childcare Lottery showed that a fifth of local authorities say that they don't have enough childcare available for working parents, and that only 1 in 10 councils has enough provision for those who are working outside the normal hours. So we need to balance this with listening to the concerns of teachers as to how to best plan a young curriculum for the youngest children if we are to truly ensure that childcare brings the positive benefit that we know that it can, that is not merely enough to have more of the same. We must have significant reform of how childcare is structured and delivered. Of course.
Minister.
Again, maybe the member will be interested to know that the work of the task force, which does draw on the expertise that the member says is so important, and that one of the elements of work is about making sure that there's national guidance on quality. So I hope that gives some reassurance that quality is very much drawn upon the expertise already out there.
Liz Smith.
I thank the Minister for that. Yes, I accept that up to a point, but I think the qualitative force has to be entailed in a more structured focus on the childcare issue, because I think it is one of the most significant concerns, and I don't think they're actually mutually exclusive, actually, and that's why we are intent on supporting Labour's motion. But I think the benefits of affordable and flexible childcare are measurable far beyond the children who actually receive it, and in assuming that we can reform that in line with the best interests of the child, I think it's essential in terms of also helping to regenerate the economy and getting more people back into work. Claire Telfer from Save the Children has said that lack of affordable and suitable childcare is a significant issue that determines parents, particularly mothers' ability to participate in the labour market. For too long, parents have been in the unenviable position of having to choose between entering the workplace and looking after their children, and those from the more disadvantaged backgrounds are much more acutely affected by that. Deputy Presiding Officer, we welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to increase the number of childcare hours to 600 by the year 2014. However, we do look rather enviously at what's happening south of the border, where there are lessons to be learned, particularly in terms of making the provision of childcare much more widespread and trying to change the focus of policy. And we're particularly interested that childcare may be available more on the basis of an hourly system rather than just in the traditional blocks. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, we're very happy to support Labour's motion.
Many thanks. That brings us to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate and I thank Hugh Henry for actually bringing it to the Chamber. I can agree with much of what's actually in the motion before us, but I can't agree with all of it, and for that reason I won't be able to support it at 5 o'clock. Because I'm not convinced that actually calling for a commission would actually move the agenda on any quicker than actually it currently is. As we've heard already, and which is noted in the amendment in the name of the Minister, that cross-party work via the Early Years Task Force is already taking place. Not only are the politicians involved in this, but the practitioners and the professionals as well. Certainly in terms of the bill going through the parliamentary process, I think the big challenge for all of us well, I've just started and we'll look at 4 minutes. I'll try and let you in later. The big challenge for all of us here in the Parliament is actually to really try to scrutinise the bill and amend the bill where possible. So that's certainly a challenge that I would lay down to every member in the Chamber today. I don't understand what a commission would do other than stall the work process that currently is underway. Now, surely creating a commission and stalling the current work stream, it goes against the sense of urgency. I will try and let you in. So we only have 4 minutes. I'll try and let you in. As I said, I mean, in terms of I don't understand that creating the Commission, installing the current workstream, it goes against the sense of urgency, as indicated by Johan Lamont during her recent conference speech. I welcome that the Government's proposals to increase the hours of free, flexible learning and childcare for all 3, 4 and looked after 2-year-olds to the minimum of 600 hours. And I'm sure, and actually I know that this is something that's actually going to be welcomed by parents in the west of Scotland and also across the whole of Scotland. And with around 120,000 children in Scotland benefiting, it's saving families around £700 per child per year. And I know that this is actually going to help families the length and breadth of the country. I do, however, agree, and I do welcome Johan Lamont's comments when she highlighted the progress on childcare that Labour made at Westminster. And she raised this during her conference speech, when she raised the point that regarding the child tax credits, the paternity leave and the extended paternity leave were Labour's achievements. And they were right. They were right to do so, to actually bring these in. But as we know, they're reserved. And it's not something that actually certainly this Parliament can actually work on to try to actually improve. Now, it's that limiting the ability of this Government and Parliament to act further. And I obviously disagree with many in the anti-independence campaign regarding the powers of this Parliament. However, the recent publication by Labour regarding the Devolution Commission has absolutely no plans to devolve welfare if there is a no vote next year. Now, surely the issue of welfare reform is something that, looking forward to, in terms of education and providing a whole holistic strategy, the issue of welfare reform is something that is really central to that agenda as well. Now, we all know, Presiding Officer, that one of the ways out of poverty is through education. And with Westminster cuts of 8% to Scotland, not to mention the welfare reform that is taking place, I gently ask the Labour Party to actually reconsider their position on working with the Tories, but to actually change their position to work with the SNP to ensure that this Parliament actually has the ability, the real ability, to really progress education further and certainly help, even more so, childcare provision in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Mary Fee to be followed by Marco Biaggi.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am proud to support the Labour motion today and fully back the calls for the creation of a Scottish Childcare Commission in order to investigate and deliver the best childcare that we can offer to families across Scotland. I am, however, disappointed that the Government have omitted the calls for a commission from their amendment. The delay in introducing the 600 hours early years provision is having a damaging impact on families now, and for the SNP to wait more than 6 years to bring in a key manifesto commitment to Scottish families must be deemed as a failure despite the rhetoric. Presiding Officer, the Equal Opportunities Committee are continuing with the inquiry into women in work, where there has been a key focus on childcare. And it has been clear from the evidence received so far that entry into the workplace can be highly dependent on the access to a range of affordable and quality childcare places for children and young people up to the age of 15. The submission from the Scottish Childminding Association summarises that there was a rise in childminding services available in 2011 and a rise in attendance of children aged nothing to 15, which equated to 3.2% of the population. However, it is very revealing that there were more childminding services per head of population in remote small towns in comparison to large urban areas, and childminding services were less abundant and slightly smaller in the most deprived areas compared with those in the more affluent areas. Added to a parent survey commissioned by Daycare Trust and Children in Scotland, which showed that some childcare costs are higher in Scotland than in England. This is a signal that more needs to be done to improve access to childcare, and in part addresses the need for a Scottish Childcare Commission. Another important childcare issue raised at last week's committee was access to childcare for disabled children. As an average, it costs 3 times as much to raise a disabled child than it does children with no disabilities. And with Scotland having some of the highest charges for childcare in Britain, affordability remains a key issue for many families and is a major barrier to employment for many women. Average weekly childcare costs equate to more than half the gross average part-time weekly earnings, and there is a strong link between inconsistent supply and varied and high costs. And the First Minister announced in March that post-independence there will be a transformational change in childcare in Scotland with a European-style system. The need for affordable and quality childcare exists now, and this Parliament has the powers to improve childcare now, as long as the Government shows political will. I'm sorry, I've only got 4 minutes and we're very tight for time. As long as the Government shows political will to work cross-party and with other organisations and people already involved in childcare. Scandinavian levels of public service, yet American levels of taxation, will not guarantee any improvement, and I look forward to the Government addressing this. Presiding Officer, last September at the Women's Employment Summit, the Deputy First Minister stated childcare should be viewed in terms of infrastructure, and I couldn't agree more with Ms Sturgeon. Children in Scotland clearly agree with the Deputy First Minister, as within their submission to the Equal Ops Committee, they stated that considerable investment is required, and they encouraged the Scottish Government to explore the possibility of using European structural funds to invest in the infrastructure of childcare. With the reforms to the welfare state and increased living costs making lives and conditions of families more and more difficult, we need all-party working to help working families now and to help mothers and fathers back into work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Marco Biaggi to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As was just said, the Equal Opportunities Committee is currently holding an inquiry into women in work, and I would especially commend to any member interested in the subject of childcare the official report of our meeting from last Thursday, which explored many of the issues, and it's one point from that I want to examine today. Jackie Brock of Children in Scotland highlighted what she put at £8 billion being spent in total on UK early years funding, but questioned whether putting the bulk of that support through tax credits, the current system that we've inherited, was the right way to go in favour of a more rights-based system. It is, after all, clearly failing an unacceptable number of families who still face unaffordable childcare. And this was an area where there was a consensus that I found very surprising. Claire Simpson from Parenting Across Scotland agreed and highlighted a change of heart by Beverly Hughes, formerly Minister for Children, Young People and Families in the Labour Government, who, since leaving office, had admitted likewise. The view was further backed by Claire Telfer of Save the Children, who looked forward very positively to the project now with the Council of Economic Advisers, which would look at the economic and financial cases for a very different approach. Denmark has often been cited as a model, both in evidence to the committee and also in our earlier inquiry into the budget. In Denmark, there is no spending on tax credits, but as a proportion of overall early years spend, twice as much goes on the direct provision of daycare as in the UK. Private provision in Denmark, while growing, is only 5% of the overall market. Competition is, however, allowed and indeed encouraged between state providers in different municipalities that work at a much more local level than our own. But crucially, while in the UK the financial support you receive is capped, in Denmark it is the sum you are charged that is capped. And while Denmark does have higher tax rates overall, the difference between its spend on childcare early education at 1.3% of GDP and the UK's at 1.1% is rather small. To put that in perspective, that gap is only a sixth of the gap in defence spending as a proportion of GDP, which of course leans in the opposite direction. We are where we are, and no one is calling for child tax credit to be removed. Indeed, we heard on Thursday from Satwat Rehman of the One Parent Families Scotland that the reduction already by the UK Government from a credit worth 80% of childcare costs to 70% of childcare costs meant that in many cases work no longer pays and childcare becomes unaffordable. Maggie Simpson of the Scottish Childminding Association pointed to bills for those she represents increasingly now going unpaid. And Save the Children reminded us that this welfare reform, one of many welfare reforms, will simply make child poverty worse.
Final minute.
There was, however, a very clear feeling that if we were starting over, we would not choose to come to this solution of a system. Liam Byrne has said almost as much, looking very positively and thoughtfully at the example of Denmark. We would instead develop a system with greater direct provision, and it's of course into this that the question of the Scottish Government's 600 hours commitment comes. Because it was welcomed. It was welcomed by one-parent families, Save the Children, partly for what it was, but also partly because it showed a desire to move towards a universal system focused on provision. It was a very welcome incremental improvement. A transformational improvement, I agree with my colleagues, is beyond our current constitutional powers in this Parliament. But more and more, the case that is being put forward for a transformational improvement is unanswerable. You just need to have a read from all the evidence that we have heard and all the evidence that we will continue to hear. And I hope very much that all the MSPs in this chamber are listening.
Thank you very much. Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I welcome Hugh Henry's debate this morning, this afternoon. The constructive approach I think he's taken in bringing it forward, and actually the tone of the motion I think very much reflects much of what was in the Save the Children briefing we received ahead of today's motion. And I think in terms of the government amendment, while there is much in there with which I wholeheartedly agree, there is I think an undertone there that we shouldn't worry our pretty little heads about anything, because everything that needs to be done is somehow being done. Now, Mr Henry has spent some time quite rightly focusing on the needs of older children and their parents. If you'll permit me, I'll maybe focus on an issue where the Scottish Liberal Democrats have been pretty consistent over the last couple of years, and on the needs of 2-year-olds, and particularly those from more disadvantaged backgrounds. We brought forward costed proposals as part of the budget. John Swinney, for his own reasons, rejected those, but I think there is an opportunity through the mechanism identified by Hugh Henry to revisit this. All the evidence shows, as I think has been acknowledged by every speaker, that it is in the very earliest years of a child's life, even the interventions we make prior to birth, that shape and determine their development into adulthood. Now, I want to be absolutely clear, the planned extension to 600 hours of early education and childcare for 3 and 4 years is something I wholeheartedly welcome, but urging Scottish ministers to be more ambitious is not the same as condemning the action that they are taking. Scottish Liberal Democrats have consistently argued proposals in the bill fail to recognise that by the age of 3 it is often too late. The First Minister, I know, is very keen on his Nobel laureates. The more he can shake a stick at, the better. So I would urge him and the Minister to heed the advice of Professor James Heckman, who suggests that the highest rate of return in education is to be derived from investment in the pre-birth to age 3 group. And this is particularly the case for children from poorer backgrounds, who by the age of 3 are often lagging a full year behind their better-off peer group in terms of cognitive development, social skills and readiness for school. I think a point acknowledged by the Minister. The Government, of course, is pledged to extend additional support to looked after 2-year-olds and those in foster care. But as Bronwyn Cohen of Children in Scotland pointed out, while valuable, this is, quote, markedly less generous than what is being offered in England and Wales, where 260,000 childcare places for 40% of 2-year-olds from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are being provided. And this, whatever the Minister says, and I can't take an intervention in 4 minutes, I'm sorry, dwarfs what is planned in Scotland. Family nurse partnerships are indeed helpful and welcome, but it's not a case of either or. These partnerships are being delivered south of the border and can work very well and effectively alongside free nursery provision. The Scottish Government has obviously pushed through its budget, but I would urge them to accept the need to look again at this issue and to look at the mechanism that Mr Henry has identified in order to do this. We mentioned this afternoon reference to Mr Salmon's willingness to meet other party leaders to discuss this issue. I think that may be a cause for optimism. The Commission proposed may be another way of doing this, and also in delivering the cross-party working on childcare advocated very strongly by Save the Children. It would also offer an opportunity to look at affordability, at availability and the flexibility of provision across Scotland, points made by Liz Smith, Mary Fee and others, and I think reflecting some of the concerns emerging from the Counting the Cost report. Deputy Presiding Officer, we all acknowledge that improving childcare provision is essential to improving outcomes for children, particularly those living in poverty. This has a direct impact on our attempts to build a strong, diverse economy, which also benefits from parents being able to go back to or indeed remain in work, a point made very well by Claire Telfer. So I would urge the Minister to support this call for a cross-party approach and use the consensus to deliver further essential progress in this vital area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joan McAlpine, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, there can be absolutely no doubt that this Government has demonstrated its commitment to childcare in early years. A 20% increase in free nursery provision since the SNP came to power in 2007 is a real achievement, particularly as the Scottish Government has faced the biggest financial squeeze experienced by any government in this Parliament since the beginning of devolution. Now the Scottish Government is building on that record and demonstrating its ambition with a Children and Young People's Bill that will result in a 45% increase in free childcare since 2007, benefiting around 120,000 children and saving families around £700 per child per year. By increasing that amount of funded hours that children aged 3 and 4 and vulnerable 2-year-olds are entitled to a minimum of 600 hours, Scotland will have the best provision in the UK. But childcare must be viewed in its broadest sense, and this bill does that. It's about helping families get out of poverty by enabling women to work and retaining more of their earnings. But it's also about providing the best quality childcare.
Neil Findlay.
Last week, NHS Lothian announced in my area that they were going to close nurseries within the hospital at St John's. Do you think that's helping people get back to work, particularly in the health service?
John McAlpine.
Well, that's a constituency matter which is actually out with my region, but I'm speaking today about the Government's ambition for childcare, and I think that's probably something that you have to raise with NHS Lothian. It's also, childcare is about providing the best quality of education and developmental care, as well as helping people out of poverty. And in the past, we've had too strict a dividing line between early years childcare and early years education. Parents must often choose between flexible private childcare and free nursery education. Flexible private childcare is often expensive and perhaps not always the best quality educationally, but it provides parents with the opportunity to drop kids off, say, before 9 and collect them after 5, whereas early years education, such as that provided by many local authority nurseries, is of a very high standard, but it's not provided in a way that suits working parents. It's very important that we break down the barriers between these two types of early years provision, which I think that the Minister is very committed to and the bill will deliver. Some opponents of the Government have suggested in the past that the Government didn't need to legislate for the additional hours, and I'm very pleased to see that there seems to be more of a consensus emerging on that point, because if you read the responses to the consultation exercise in the bill, the vast majority of responses, about 3/4, agree that the number of hours should be increased, and even more, 83%, agree that flexibility should be improved. However, many respondents also identified operational resourcing and other practical issues that they felt would need to be resolved to enable the proposal to be enacted.
Final minute.
These included, obviously, funding, the implications for workforce planning, such as arrangements for staffing during longer hours and holiday periods, and also staff training. So you need to maintain the quality of provision. That was a very strong message coming from those who responded to the consultation. Local authorities, in particular, pointed out the difficulties of delivering a more flexible service, because that's always more difficult and expensive to manage. And while I have sympathy with local authorities in meeting these challenges, meet them they must, and parents have waited far too long for more flexible provision that's also of a high quality. And that's why this bill is needed, and I welcome the Minister's remarks. I'm also delighted that the First Minister has said a transformational shift towards childcare should be one of the first tasks of an independent Scotland. The Government expenditure and revenue statistics show that Scotland pays more than it gets back from London, amounting to more than £800 a head for every man, woman and child in the country. I can't imagine a better way to spend a portion of that £800 than on our youngest children, but the only way we'll achieve that is through independence next year.
Thank you. Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Presiding Officer, I'm pleased that this hasn't been an excessively party political debate, at least not compared to the next one, I'm sure, and that there is much that we can agree on and work together on. I think actually the most important thing that we can agree on today is that childcare is a massive issue, and it's not very often, in fact, in the history of politics in Scotland and the UK that has been the case. I was actually very lucky, because before I was ever elected as an MP in 1992, I met this group of women in Pilton, in my constituency, who were in a childcare action group, and they really had a massive effect on my thinking at that time. In fact, childcare, because of that, was the main subject of my maiden speech in 1992 when I said it was really important as an anti-poverty strategy, it was crucial for gender equality, and it was also a key part of economic policy. And all of that is still true today, although I was very remiss, of course, because it's also absolutely essential for child development. And I'm glad that Liam McCarthy mentioned James Heckman, who, of course, has done a lot of work on this and shown how investment in the early years pays you many, many times over in future years. So I think there has been a lot of progress over the last 20 years or so, and that's been acknowledged today in terms of what the Labour government did, nursery education for 3- and 4-year-olds, and the development of childcare tax credits. Although, of course, it was interesting what Marco Biaggi said about that. There was a choice between demand-side subsidies and supply-side subsidies, and I have a lot of sympathy with those who would prefer to have supply-side subsidies. But I think we should also acknowledge that it did benefit a very large number of parents, what the Labour government did with childcare tax credits. And I think it's very regrettable that the current government has reduced that from 80% to 70%, because that's made the problem worse. Because when I talk to parents now about childcare, the big issues are affordability, of course availability as well, but in a sense the key issue, the primary issue, is affordability. And certainly parents talk to me about childcare just as much as they did all those years ago. Now, let's also agree that we are making progress. I certainly welcome the 600 hours and the commitment to more flexibility, and I think everybody basically will acknowledge that that is an important step forward. And talking to people in my own area of Edinburgh who are developing that, I think there's a lot of interesting developments, different models of flexible early years, and also in Edinburgh actually expanding the number of nursery schools. That may be a particular Edinburgh issue, although I did say to someone last week, I would mention to the Minister, why on earth do we have to consult when we open a new nursery school? I understand we consult when we close one. I don't understand why we consult when we open one, and that's happening soon in my constituency. So that's one very important part. But clearly after-school care is crucial as well, because for working parents, that in fact is probably mentioned to me more often than anything else. So, well, I welcome if there's more money for the out-of-school care network. And again, I would acknowledge that Edinburgh is doing quite a lot on this, because they had this idea, actually in the Labour manifesto, if I can be partisan from it, about childcare co-ops. And the main thrust of the development of childcare co-ops is going to be to help and support the development of after-school care. So again, I applaud the Edinburgh Council for doing that. But I do feel that that is a crucial area that we have to put more and more emphasis on, the development of after-schools care, and really supporting that on the supply side, I think, will be necessary, because the tax credits don't cover that for everybody else. Time's running out. Obviously, the third area is 2-year-olds. There's a whole debate about the best way for that. Again, the Scottish Government's taken an important step, but should that be developed further targeting so it includes more people, or should we perhaps offer a small number of hours to everybody? I think there's an important debate about that as well. So what is being done by the Scottish Government, particularly the 600 hours, is an important step, but I'm sure we can all agree there are many more steps to take.
Thank you very much. Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you very much, President Officer. Let me begin, as I want to do in this type of debate, by declaring interest as a father of 2 preschool-age children. And in that position, let me say, I do know how difficult it can be to secure decent, reliable and affordable childcare. And my wife and I are very fortunate to have been able to arrange such for our own children. And I very much believe that an aspiration to securing further improvements in the provision of childcare across Scotland is something we should all welcome, all be working towards. But I think we should put this debate in some context, and we should look at the situation in Scotland today. As Joan McAlpine set out, there has been an increase in free nursery provision by some 20% since 2007, and the Children and Young People's Bill will legislate for a 45% increase in the same period of time, with some 120,000 children in Scotland to benefit by the provisions of that bill. And I also have already recognised the concerns that are there about the cost of childcare. No, Save the Children has done a lot of work in that area. I've been very happy to work with them in the past. We should be happy to work with them again in the future. But I think we should recognise that costs are actually stabilising in Scotland, but increasing elsewhere. These are figures secured by the Daycare Trust. They published a report in March of this year which indicated that childcare costs for the under-5s have seen no increase in Scotland, compared with increases of 4.2% for under-2s and 6.6% for 2-year-olds and over across the rest of the UK. So I think it's important to put that in a little context. And also, as we move forward, I think the move to the 600 hours childcare provision is hugely welcome and compares favourably to the position elsewhere. I know that there are some who have made much of extending childcare further to 2-year-olds. Liam MacArthur espoused that position again, and the UK government's position is often posited as an example of what to do. But I think we should look at the reality behind that proposal, because proposed childcare ratios of staff to children in England will increase to 1 to 4 for under-1s, 1 to 6 for 2-year-olds, and could be 1 to 13 for 3 and 4-year-olds, whereas Scottish ratios are much better. And that has led to criticism from Professor Cathy Nutt-Brown, the Chief Executive of the Daycare Trust, Anand Shukla, and the founder of Mumsnet, no less, has suggested that the UK Government needs to rethink its plans. Very briefly.
Liam MacArthur.
Grateful to Jamie Hepburn taking an intervention. On the issue of ratios, will they not accept that the ratios south of the border have been far better than the ratios north of the border over many years? And therefore, yes, it's an issue of quality, but the safeguards that are put in place in terms of additional qualifications can actually help us achieve that.
Jamie Hepburn, you're on the last minute.
I wouldn't actually accept that they're much better for many years in the past. I think they're roughly similar, and I think going forward the issue is that they're going to be dramatically worse in England if these proposals go ahead. Can I just turn very briefly and conclude on the issue of a childcare commission? I thought it was interesting to see Joanne Lamont's conference speech said we don't need the Council of Economic Advisers to tell us what a difference investing in education and childcare make, but apparently we need a commission. Well, I think that ignores the fact that work is ongoing to dramatically improve access to childcare. We've spoken about the Children and Young People's Bill. We're aware of the Early Years Task Force. We're also aware of the work of the Council of Economic Advisers. So let's not pretend that this work isn't happening. This work is underway, and the proposition seems to be that we should create another commission and wait for its conclusions before we make further improvements. I think that's a nonsensical position. I commend the Scottish Government for their work, and I support their amendment.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and to call on Annabel Golding. You have 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Hugh Henry is to be commended for bringing this debate to the Chamber. Amongst the many issues which legitimately demand the attention of politicians in this Parliament, I am clear that childcare should be at the centre of our focus, in the forefront of our discussions. And I say that not because I've been in the Parliament for nearly 14 years, not because in that time I've heard numerous suggestions from all parties, whether in government or opposition, about how we should deal with childcare, but because I start from first principles. Some parents decide to have a non-working mother or father and can afford to make that decision. That's fine. For the majority of parents, that is not an option. The reality of modern life is that both parents work, possibly out of choice, probably out of necessity. In working, they bring much-needed skills to the economy, stability to their workplace environment, and generate very welcome spend in the economy. That can only be regarded as positive. For some parents who cannot access childcare, that opportunity does not exist at all, and that's wrong. And for these reasons, I regard provision of childcare as essential as provision of healthcare or schooling or maintaining our public transport system. Now, to avoid confusion, I am not advocating a new publicly funded universal benefit, but I am saying we can do an awful lot more to match the needs and responsibilities of parents with a reasonable and more effective support from government. And the other very important consequence of childcare is, of course, a direct benefit to the child, a benefit which may range from learning new personal skills and nurturing positive relationships with other children to embarking on the actual process of learning, and Hugh Henry quite rightly referred to that. Now, on the general proposition of how we as a Parliament have fared in this front over nearly 14 years, I think the answer has to be patchy. Certainly better than when we started, but progress recently has been more glacial than swift. On the positive front, the statutory provision of 475 hours per annum for 3- and 4-year-olds introduced in 2007 to improve on the previous 415 hours was helpful. and the proposed increase to 600 hours by 2014 is welcome. It's overdue progress. It has, after all, taken 7 years to accomplish. So where does Scotland sit in the general scheme of things in relation to childcare? Well, the statutory provision is not as good as England. Their childcare entitlement is being extended to 2-year-olds from 40% of the most disadvantaged families from 2014. The Work and Pension Secretary, Ian Duncan-Smith, is currently in discussion with childcare providers to persuade them to price services on an hourly rate rather than in blocks. And this would make childcare more affordable, as parents would not have to pay for care when they didn't need it. I'm sorry, with the time, Minister, I do ask your forgiveness. There is not sufficient space.
Final minute.
In a country the size of Scotland, why can we not have a similar national clarity? And if the Scottish Government is serious about recognising the needs of parents for flexibility in the hours of childcare provision, as Joe McAlpine alluded to, why can't it be available from 7 in the morning to 7 at night and spread across 2 days instead of 3? That would transform employment opportunity for many parents. And so would extending support to parents who work less than 16 hours per week. Now, where are these options? Who is investigating their provision? I have to say that a commission of qualified people with a focused remit, as proposed by Mr Henry, sounds to me a better bet than a General Council of Economic Advisers. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, good things are happening. I don't deny it. But better things are happening in England, and with imagination and innovation, we can make better things happen in Scotland, within the existing constitutional settlement and without even having to wait for a referendum. Presiding Officer, Mr Henry's motion is sensible and reasonable, and I support it.
Thank you very much. I now call on Michael Russell, 6 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to stress what unites us in this debate rather than divides us, as Malcolm Chisholm very effectively does. But you will, I hope, forgive me if I say something just before that in the light of the contribution we've just had. I thought the word glacial was very fascinating from Annabel Goldie. The reality, of course, is that the actions of the Tory and Liberal government south of the border are taking away from working families, just in the changes in child tax credits and working tax credits, £700 a year, which equates almost exactly to the sum of money that we're trying to put into the pockets of hard-pressed parents. So if we want ice analogies, perhaps the best thing we could do is to thaw the icy heart of Ian Duncan-Smith on these anti-family actions. No, I'm not. I want to make some progress. I'm sorry. Let me now try and turn to a more positive theme. I want to stress those things which I think Malcolm Chisholm was absolutely right to stress, the things that should unite us across this chamber. First of all, the indivisibility of childcare and education. There is no debate about that whatsoever, and we have to make sure that that is maintained. Secondly, that there is no weakening, and should be no weakening, right across this chamber on the issues of standards in terms of childcare. Thirdly, that there should be no weakening on the commitment to continued progress. And indeed, I just want to correct those Labour members who seem to indicate that nothing happened after 2007. We moved in 2007 from 412.5 hours, which was enough for Labour, though a Labour member shouts not enough. That was enough for Labour. We moved to 475, and we're now going to move to 600. So there's no weakening, and indeed there's a unanimity across this chamber that we should continue to make progress. There is also no weakening on the cross-party approach to this. Indeed, there is absolutely no weakening on bringing the experts to bear. Again, Annabel Goldie seemed to imply this wasn't happening. The Early Years Task Force, whose remit, of course, is wider than early years, and particularly in its subgroup on early childhood learning and care, 0 to 14 is actually the remit there. That group involves not just the politicians, who Hugh Henry wants to gather around this table, and apparently Annabel Goldie wants them around the table too. It involves all the organisations, the real experts in this matter. And it also involves, and Mary Fee said this should be a cross-party activity, she should have looked to her right, because next to her is a member of that Early Years Task Force. And indeed it does involve other members. And I am very, very happy if people have the expertise that Malcolm Chisholm has displayed here today. If other members have that expertise, then I would be very happy to see them involved in that Early Years Task Force. So there's no weakening at all on the desire for a cross-party informed contribution to this debate. Where I think the problem does lie is that Malcolm Chisholm brought three good ideas to the table, and we'll take them away and look at them. We didn't get a single idea in Hugh Henry's speech, and that's regrettable, because what I want to see is those ideas coming forward, those ideas with suggestions about how they're funded, and they will be looked at, because I give an absolute commitment that the Early Years Task Force and the existing structures that include the real experts, those structures will look at any idea that comes forward, and will do so openly. We're quite happy to look at those openly and to have that public debate. But we should know, and we shouldn't be afraid of acknowledging, that there is a better solution, a better long-term solution. Indeed, I pay credit to Joanne Lamont in her conference speech on the 21st of April, who said Labour in government had a childcare strategy within months of coming into office. We introduced child tax credits to supplement child benefit. We introduced paternity and extended maternity leave. That recognised another indivisibility. And it's the indivisibility of tax and benefits and labour market regulation. No, I'm not taking Mr Finlay, because I have to say this is a serious point that needs serious attention. It is the indivisibility of those three things that require to be considered. And in those circumstances, we need the powers in this Parliament to influence those things. So the real long-term benefit that can come is from having those powers in this Parliament. And those facts are absolutely indisputable. That is the way in which you will make progress. But I am entirely willing to accept that we should do as much as we can within existing powers. That's why we have made the progress that we have made. That's why we want to go on doing so. And that's why I would really welcome the ideas that might come from Hugh Henry and from his colleagues. And we will look at them very closely. And I say that to the Tory benches and to the Liberal benches. Bring those ideas forward. Bring ideas about how we'll fund it. And we will look at them very closely indeed. But when we have, Presiding Officer, the normal powers of a normal nation, then we'll be able to do even more. And we will also be able to do more, and I go back to the point with which I started, we'll be able to do more than simply mitigating the harm that is done elsewhere. Because the figure I started with is a stark figure. Even one set of changes in benefit regulations from south of the border are taking away the benefit that we're bringing in 600 hours. That is the reality. And it's actually doing something about that has to be a key priority in changing childcare. And just in case any Labour members thought that they were comfortable on this matter, we also have to take action still where action is needed. Because, of course, the alternative Queen's speech from Labour contained no commitment, for example, to remove the bedroom tax. I have to say that what we want to see, even while Westminster is still there, is some action, not just the usual words.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Neil Bibby to wind up the debate. 8 minutes, please, Mr Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's customary for the member closing a debate to remark on how it has gone, and I think it generally has been a good debate. There have been a number of important points raised. Have we improved childcare this afternoon? No, of course we haven't. But we could take a step forward to improving childcare by establishing a cross-party commission on the issue. I think we would all accept that it's not enough just to talk about childcare across the chamber for a couple of hours every now and then. We need to get round the table, talk through the problems, identify the solutions and deliver the support our families need on a cross-party basis. We need a comprehensive childcare strategy, as Hugh Henry said, and a childcare commission to make this a reality. That's why Joanne Lamont has offered to work with the First Minister and other party leaders on childcare. The reason for that and the purpose for Labour bringing forward this debate is to support Scottish families, families from Paisley to Peebles, families in Ayr and families in Aberdeen, because we know childcare problems are problems that face families in every part of Scotland. We welcome the Scottish Government's proposal to extend preschool care to 600 hours for 3 and 4-year-olds in the Children and Young People Bill, and we recognise that in our motion. That will build on the progress made by Labour in government on preschool education and our family-friendly policies such as child tax credits, maternity and paternity pay, which Mike Russell and Stuart McMillan have mentioned. But if we are being honest, if we are representing the views of families we are elected to represent, we must all accept in every party that not enough is being done to support families with childcare. The view that the childcare problems of 2013 will not be solved by the Children and Young People Bill is not a political point. It is the reality if you listen to families in our communities. Three things are as evident, Presiding Officer, now as when Hugh Henry mentioned them at the start of this debate. Provision does not meet the current needs of children and families of Scotland. Childcare is expensive, and the educational underpinning of early years provision should be paramount. And I think there's a number of members have highlighted many of these issues. And I would say to the SNP members who have questioned the need for a commission, there are issues that need to be addressed now, and there are issues that need to be looked at for the longer term as well, and that is why we need a commission. Issues of preschool childcare have... Yes, certainly.
Minister.
Whether or not he's completely discounting the work of the Early Years Task Force, which is looking at a number of the issues that have been raised today, and her bringing in on board expertise, expert practitioners from around the country together to try and formulate a way forward based on the knowledge that they have. Is he completely discounting that work?
Neil Bibby.
No, I'm not completely discounting that work at all. If you'd listened to what Hugh Henry and others have said, we need a rounded view on childcare provision in Scotland that looks from the birth to the age of 14 of childcare provision, and I think that is what the point that you are missing, Minister. Issues of preschool childcare have been mentioned, out-of-school care have been mentioned, childcare provision at work, for example. Neil Finlay mentioned the issue of childcare at St John's Hospital. These are issues that need to be looked at. Issues of childcare for disabled children that Mary Fee mentioned, we need to look at that. Mary Fee and Marco Biaggi mentioned the Equal Opportunities Committee. I think the impression given by the SNP members to the reaction to 600 hours is questionable. As at the Equal Opportunities Committee, in an answer to Marco Biaggi, Jackie Brock of Children in Scotland said our members have a rather lukewarm view on the 600 hours and the contribution that it will make to that long-term vision. In terms of childcare costs, that was mentioned by Hugh Henry at the start. SNP members have said that the new extension of hours will save families £700 a year. Well, given that there's been a 7-year delay in that policy, it goes that families have been cost £700 a year by your delay in extending that policy. We know that childcare costs are high. We know from a recent Save the Children report that on average childcare payments took 33% of household income. We know many families believe this is a barrier to work, and too many have had to cut down on food and payment of household bills to pay for childcare. Age segregation and geographical dislocation of services can also create difficulty for parents. In the area I represent, Save the Children recently took evidence, and I was shocked to find that in some cases parents were having to pick up their children from 3 different establishments because no one service dealt with children of 1 year, 3 years and 6 years old, and that is if parents can find childcare at all. These are just some of the challenges that families we are elected to represent are facing. We need to develop a Scottish system of childcare that is affordable, high quality, accessible, flexible and meets the needs of families. It is therefore disappointing that the SNP Minister, in her judgment, doesn't appear to think establishing a cross-party commission is a good idea. The SNP amendment does talk about the Early Years Task Force. The Task Force is doing important work, but as I have said before, we need to look at how we support families with children from birth to the age of 14. We absolutely need to look at preschool education and care for 2-year-olds, where we could be doing more. As has been said by Liam McCarthy and the Lib Dems, we are massively behind the rest of the UK. Again, that is why we want to work with parties across the chamber to look how we can improve childcare for 2-year-olds. We also need a renewed focus on supporting out-of-school care, a focus on how we support the retention and expansion of breakfast clubs, after-school clubs and holiday clubs. These services for school-aged children are crucial for working parents. They allow parents to work and to provide for their children. The Scottish Out-of-School Care Association reports that most services are managed and administered by parents themselves who form charities or cooperatives, employ staff themselves and pay dearly for the service. I would like to pay tribute to those parents, but we also need to look at how we can support parents who want to retain or set up community or cooperative childcare services, as they are doing in Edinburgh Council, and Malcolm Chisholm mentioned that. As Hugh Henry said at the start of this debate, it is time for us to work together across the Parliament and to do so with some humility. We appear to have a consensus in the Chamber for a commission, with the exception of the SNP. I am pleased that out the Chamber organisations such as Children in Scotland support the idea, and also organisations like Save the Children want us to work on a cross-party basis. So I would plead with the Minister to change her mind. None of us here have all the answers to the early years and childcare questions. As a Parliament, we know that we need to do more, but we realise that this will cost. We know that families across Scotland want real solutions to their problems. We need to take advice and come to an agreement on the way forward. That is why we are asking for all parties to support the establishment of a Scottish Childcare Commission to establish how best to expand affordable, accessible, good quality childcare and early years provision across Scotland. Our children and families deserve no less.
Many thanks. And that concludes the debate on motion number S4M 06475 on childcare. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number S4M 06474 in the name of Jackie Baillie on Scotland's Health Service. I'd invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press their request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible thereafter. And I would now call on Jackie Baillie, when you are ready, and in your own time, Ms Baillie, to speak to and move the motion in your name. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I always welcome the opportunity to debate the NHS in this chamber. It is an institution we all hold in the highest regard, and we are in admiration of what is achieved on a daily basis by our hard-working NHS staff. But that said, there are some really difficult issues that we need to have an honest and open debate about. Everyone is aware of the scale of the demographic challenge that we face. There are more of us living to a ripe old age and more of us potentially relying on health and social care services. And I don't think we need to rehearse the arguments in here. We all agree that we should be funding much earlier intervention to avoid people having to engage with care services. We all agree that keeping people out of hospital that don't need to be there is the right thing to do. And it's not only better for the public purse, it's also much better for the individual concerned too. And we all agree that we need to shift the balance of care. Indeed, it's fair to say that we've been agreeing on much of this for some time, but we've actually failed to deliver the kind of transformational change that is actually required. We will shortly be debating the integration of health and social care, the governance arrangements, the financial procedures, accountable officers, and a myriad of structural issues besides. But let's not forget that culture is equally important and is not something that the Cabinet Secretary can legislate for. We have yet to resolve fundamental questions like how you bring together two very different approaches. We have, of course, an NHS that is free at the point of need, that assesses your needs and then treats you, and a social care system that assesses your needs, rations what can be provided based on how near a crisis you are, and then charges you for providing a service. We will struggle to succeed if we ignore such fundamental questions. And I know the Cabinet Secretary is grappling with some of these thorny issues. So I was therefore most interested in his reported comments to the Unison Conference in Glasgow on the 24th of April, just 2 weeks ago, about demographic change. He said, and I quote, "We're still going to need the same number of beds, the same number of hospitals, the same number of doctors and nurses, just to stand still." And if you were in any doubt, this was confirmed by a number of national newspapers and welcomed in many quarters as a firm commitment, a clear direction of travel. There was nothing equivocal about the statement, and I think you'd all agree there's nothing equivocal about the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing. Jackson Carlaw, indeed, is fond of saying that the Cabinet Secretary is indeed a pragmatic man, and I have to say, I agree. But it would appear that since that statement, somebody's got to him. The Cabinet Secretary's amendment is the parliamentary equivalent of shouting, "There's a squirrel," to distract attention. And instead of talking about what we will need to do to tackle demographic change and helping us genuinely to understand his comments about no change to beds, hospitals and doctors and nurses, he wants instead a discussion on minimum unit pricing. Now, Presiding Officer, both are substantial subjects in their own right. But please, for goodness sake, let's not use minimum unit pricing as a cover for avoiding a discussion on the level of health services that we can expect in the future. And I have to confess, I'm therefore left wondering whether the Cabinet Secretary meant what he said. Has he been silenced by his civil servants? Or is this just another case of saying one thing in public to a Unison audience, but another thing entirely in private? Now, let's suppose for a minute that the Cabinet Secretary is genuine, because I do believe he is. Well, clearly NHS Lothian didn't get that message when they were discussing proposals to close 3 hospitals, the Astley, Ainslie, Costophon and Liberton, all in the week that the Cabinet Secretary said there would be no hospital closures. And this is likely, of course, to lead to a reduction in beds. Now, I absolutely applaud the valiant effort of the Chief Executive of NHS Lothian to convince us otherwise, but there is no disputing the facts. In 2007, there were 2,518 beds in NHS Lothian, and for the last available quarter, there are 2,411. That's a reduction by anybody's standards. But this, of course, is not the whole picture, as the argument is made that beds in the care sector will make up for any reduction in hospital beds. There will need to be further capacity to just stand still, never mind make up the loss of beds. And if you consider Edinburgh City Council, they are going to have to cope with the closure of 5 private care homes, very sheltered accommodation, announced recently by Cairn Housing Association. And that's on top of coping with the changing demographics. So local authorities across Scotland are struggling to cope now, never mind as the numbers of older people increase. And the capacity just isn't there, and there is no promise from NHS Lothian to re-provide each and every one of these beds in the care sector. So consequently, we lose beds. And if you delve a bit deeper, specifically on page 166 of the board papers, they note in their clinical strategic framework that the shape of our workforce is changing. There will be fewer doctors overall, and where doctors' skills are needed in specialist areas of care, these may need to be provided on fewer sites to ensure that services are safe. Let me just repeat, there will be fewer doctors overall. So the number of doctors will decrease. Doesn't all of that fly in the face of the Cabinet Secretary's promise to the Unison Conference in Glasgow? And it's not confined to Lothian. Western Isles are proposing to cut beds from 89 to 53. Other health boards like NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde are reviewing acute services. And I don't think the Cabinet Secretary is saying at the outset that the review will be no change to hospital numbers, bed numbers, or indeed staff numbers, or perhaps he is. And when I consider the SNP's record on all of this, it does make interesting reading. Bed numbers reduced by over 1,400 since 2007, and this despite an SNP promise made by Nicola Sturgeon in 2006 to increase the number of beds. Nursing numbers reduced by around 2,000, and perhaps most seriously, the intake of student nurses slashed by 12% in 2011-12, a further cut of 10% in 2012-13. Now, I think we would agree that this potentially is a damaging decision that will have serious consequences that will be felt in the years to come. And we are storing up trouble for the future. And if you don't listen to me, let's listen to the RCN. The RCN tell us that cuts to the workforce are not only bad news for patient care, but mean that the remaining staff in the NHS are increasingly overstretched. Unison report that there are serious concerns about patient safety, with a reduction in nurse-to-patient ratios. And the BMA call for an open and honest debate about what the NHS can and cannot afford. And they also point to the need to increase resourcing to social care and to primary care if we are to properly meet the changing demographic profile of our population. None of this, Presiding Officer, is easy. I recognise there are real financial constraints, both in the NHS and in local government too. And in that context, the Cabinet Secretary's comments were interesting, some would say positively extraordinary. They are a complete departure from his department's thinking, a departure certainly from the thinking of his predecessor, and I think a departure from the general direction that health boards are travelling in. I believe they merit a serious debate. Can we have the best of both worlds? Can we maintain bed numbers and hospital numbers, which flies in the face of what health boards are planning to do? Should we maintain staff numbers so that we maintain the best possible quality of care? And is there a trade-off in there? These are serious issues that merit a serious debate. And how do we make sure that we invest in the social care sector and truly shift the balance of care? Presiding Officer, having promised one thing in public, I fear the Cabinet Secretary is indeed saying another thing in private. Perhaps he was simply telling the Unison audience what they wanted to hear and has since been pulled back into line by his civil servants. But, if the Cabinet Secretary is serious, then we urgently need a national strategy and national planning. Simply announcing that there will be no bed reductions, the same number of hospitals, the same number of nurses and doctors, requires thought if it is to be more than simply a glib soundbite. Someone said to me that the Cabinet Secretary was simply playing to the gallery and making it up as he goes along. Presiding Officer, I thought that remark was uncharitable, but I have to say some evidence of thinking on the part of the Government that underpins the Cabinet Secretary's comments would indeed be very helpful. Or if his comments were made in error, then please tell us, not least because the people of Scotland deserve an honest debate about their NHS.
Many thanks. And I now call on Alec Neil to speak to and move Amendment S4M 06474.1. Cabinet Secretary, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm happy to move the amendment in my name. As Jackie Baillie rightly said, and it's one of the few things she rightly said, society is constantly changing and its needs are evolving. The remarkable achievement is that the health service in Scotland is and has been changing with it. And I welcome this opportunity just to put on record my gratitude for the dedication and commitment of all our hard-working NHS staff across Scotland and those in social care as well. And I recognise, obviously, that that gratitude is shared across the Chamber. While the shape of the NHS in Scotland has evolved since its foundation, its core principles of providing the best health care possible freely to all regardless of their income or need has to be preserved. For these principles to be protected, we must ensure that the health service in Scotland continues to develop with the needs of the Scottish people. And under this government, we will maintain and improve, as we have been doing, both the levels of quality and provision that Scotland's health service requires. The Government will continue to protect the health budget. We recognise that if we want to have a first-class health service in Scotland, the resources need to be there to deliver it. And as we look to the future, there are twin challenges to be met: an ageing population and the increase in healthcare demands as a consequence of changing lifestyles, such as issues around tobacco and cheap alcohol. Can I say that some of the picture that Jackie Baillie presents, I think, is rather dark and inaccurate? And let me deal with a number of the issues that she raises. First of all, I think she does ignore some of the reality of the improvements in the National Health Service in recent times. She mentioned the number of beds. Let me tell her, if you look at the total number of beds in the National Health Service today, it's just over 24,000. Now, that is a 12% drop over the last 5 years. But I've been checking the bed numbers for the previous 5 years. And while Jackie Baillie's colleagues were in government in charge of the health service, the number of beds between 2002 and 2007 declined by 13%. Yes.
Can I say that I hope that the total chamber is proud of that reduction, because these, of course, were the closure of long-stay institutions like Lennox Castle Hospital, enabling people with learning disabilities to live in communities, and I hope he would recognise that.
With all due respect, if Jackie Baillie checks the figures, she will find that they closed a substantial number of acute beds as well. The point is this, Presiding Officer. Let me make 3 points. First of all, in terms of beds, we do need a proper planning tool to manage the bed capacity in a fast-changing health service, and have announced today major advances in developing such a bed management tool. Secondly, this is not just a numbers game. This is about the mix of beds. For example, one of the big challenges in our 30 acute hospitals is the balance between medical beds and surgical beds. And the third thing is, if you look at the reasons why there have been particular reductions in bed numbers, they have been for very good reasons. One of the reasons is the drop in the number of long-term psychiatric beds, because we've been treating people in the community instead of in hospital. The long-term reduction in geriatric beds, because we've been treating more people in the community and not in hospital. But also, if you look at the shift in many areas to day surgery, then by definition you do not need the same number of beds for the throughput in day surgery, which has risen by 10% in recent years, as you do for longer stays in hospital. And if you look at the turnaround time in hospitals, between coming into hospital for elective procedures, for example, and discharge, the turnaround time is reducing all the time. And it's these issues that quite rightly drive bed numbers. And just for clarification, the point I was making at Unison, a point I've made many times in this chamber, is if you look at the particular challenges of over 75-year-olds in Scotland, over the next 20 years or so, there is going to be roughly a doubling of the number of over 75-year-olds in Scotland. Now, if we achieve a 50% reduction in hospital admissions amongst those 75-year-olds, and don't go any further, by definition, you would still need the same number of beds for that particular group. And that's the bit that's missed from the quotation, for that particular group. Now, I believe we can actually reduce, I don't have the time, unfortunately, but I believe we can reduce the number, I believe we can reduce the hospitalisation rate even more. And I've certainly seen recently in East Ayrshire, for example, as a result of new innovations, new technology, a pilot which has seen a 70% reduction in hospitalisation amongst the older age group. Now, of course, on the other hand, we'll continue to expand day care services. And let me give some other figures to Jackie Bailey. Workforce numbers. Over 700 more qualified nurses in the last 5 years. Over 800 more consultants. Over 250 more GPs. And over 650 more allied health professionals. So the investment in the workforce has been paired with an increasing demand in the National Health Service. And we're seeing the Health Service diagnosing, treating and caring for far more people than ever before. In the last year alone, Presiding Officer, inpatient cases grew by almost 5,000 to 253,000. Outpatients grew by over 20,000 to 1.1 million. The number of accident and emergency presentations exceeded 1.5 million. And since 2006-07, the number of day cases has grown by 43,000 a year and is now nearly 450,000 day cases. I would have thought these were all welcome developments. Over the last 5 years, GP appointments are up over 3%, GP practice nurse appointments over 10%, outpatient attendances by nearly 5%, and inpatient and day case discharges by nearly 7%. And even with all these, I don't have time, unfortunately, even with all these additional...
a minute or so, if you would like.
Quite a lot still to say, Presiding Officer. Even with...
Jackson Carlo.
I'm just wondering, Presiding Officer, if the Cabinet Secretary will be speaking to his amendment at any point in his speech.
That is a matter for the Cabinet Secretary and is not a point of order.
I'm outlining the improvements referred to in the amendment. Can I thank Mr Carlo for a point of order? Can I also just say that the measure of patient satisfaction over the last 6 years, has risen dramatically, from just under 81% to over 88%. So that indicates to me that patients are increasingly satisfied with the quality and range of provision that they are receiving from the National Health Service in Scotland. Now, when we look to the future, we do face major challenges. I've already referred to the ageing of the population, and no doubt Mr Carlo will point out that he and I will now come into that category of over 75-year-olds over the next 20 years. But it's not just the ageing of the population in Scotland. Our population is at a record level. That means demands in the health service are at a record level.
We know the budgetary situation and the constraints, even although we are passing on the Barnett consequentials. Inflation in the health service is twice as high as inflation generally. And, of course, there is the challenge of meeting inequalities and access to health care, let alone for the particular challenges relating from overuse of tobacco and alcohol abuse. So the reality, Presiding Officer, is despite the hugely increasing demands, despite the constraints in our budget imposed by our friends in London, despite all these challenges of a rising and ageing population, we are providing a far better health service, investing a record amount, and that is why I am proud to move this amendment in my name.
At last. Thank you very much. I now call on Annette Milne. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The very serious issues highlighted in both Labour's motion and the Scottish Government's amendment could fill a whole day's debate, and they can really only just be touched on in the time available to us. So I'll therefore concentrate on the infrastructure and workforce matters raised by Labour, and my colleague Jackson Carlaw will deal with the issue of introducing minimum alcohol unit pricing as a public health measure. To sum up what the Cabinet Secretary has said in support of his motion. We've talked for many years now of the increasing challenges facing the NHS, due principally to an ageing population, but also to the many health problems resulting from lifestyle issues. The Health and Sport Committee heard last October that ageing of the population alone, with no alteration in the prevalence of disease or the age-specific rates of becoming disabled, will result in 67% more people with disability over the next 20 years. And in those aged 85 and over, the numbers with disability will have doubled. In addition, the proportion of the older population with arthritis, coronary heart disease, stroke and dementia will have increased by 40% by 2025, just 12 years from now. And many of these people will have several long-term conditions affecting their health and well-being. Whilst figures I've quoted were from south of the border, there is no reason to suspect that Scotland is greatly different in this respect, and the increasing numbers of people who require care have been described as a huge train coming towards our health service system, and it isn't clear whether that system is in a fit state to cope. And here I will quote the BMA, who state that there is an urgent and growing need to improve decision-making on what health and care services are needed locally and how they can be best delivered, and that there needs to be an open and honest debate about what the NHS can and cannot do to deliver in the longer term. I don't always agree with the BMA, but I do think they're right to say that services will need to be improved and reorganised to meet changing demands, and that this can only be done effectively with the engagement of those, including doctors and nurses, who deliver services locally. I am pleased to note the Government's stated commitment to at least maintain the level of quality of provision in NHS Scotland in face of increasing challenges, though the Cabinet Secretary's quoted comments to the recent Unison Conference were perhaps something of a hostage to fortune in the context of health boards trying to rationalise their service in the state as demands increase. It's worth looking at the Lothian Strategic Clinical Framework for the next 7 years to put in context the apparently threatened Edinburgh hospitals. It states, "We will look at the physical space and land that we own and make decisions based on clinical need, on opportunities to safely move off sites, reducing land and property running costs, thus releasing funding to be invested in other services. We will continue a programme of primary care premises development, providing accessible, community-based healthcare facilities. Less hospital inpatient care may mean we need fewer hospital beds, with those we do need provided in appropriate and fit-for-purpose accommodation. And finally, it states, we will review some of our smaller sites, such as the Astley, Ainsley, Corstorphine and Liberton hospitals, which provide a less than optimal setting for patient care in terms of privacy, dignity and safety, as we modernise the facilities and the locations in which care of older people is provided." Now, I don't profess, Presiding Officer, to be familiar with the Lothian hospitals, but we have similar ongoing issues regarding the hospital estate in Grampian, where provision is gradually being realigned to cope with a changing population and changing demands, and I do think that that is sometimes necessary. Change is never popular, but to cope in future, we will need proper integration of health and social care, and people will have to be a little bit more self-reliant, assisted by steadily improving technology such as telecare, which can now be successfully used by elderly people who have no knowledge of computing, for example. But whilst the balance of care continues to shift towards more community-based and social care and more service provision by the third sector, we will still see a high demand for acute services,
partly because of ever-advancing medical and surgical technology, but also because of greater numbers of older people. And this brings me finally to the nursing workforce, which is facing unprecedented pressures, according to the RCN. I've seen this at first hand, at night in a busy orthopaedic ward looked after by only one charge nurse and one auxiliary, dealing with 6 intravenous infusions and a number of very frail elderly patients. It would take just one emergency in a ward like that for the system to fall apart, and the management are well aware of it. So the planning tools for nursing to ensure the right number of nurses and healthcare assistants in the right place at the right time in all hospital settings, and now mandatory for all health boards to use, can help if they're used regularly and in every ward and health team. Unfortunately, some health boards are continuing to cut the nursing workforce, causing yet another postcode lottery of patient care and putting immense strain on overworked nurses and healthcare assistants.
You must close, please.
To conclude, Presiding Officer, and to quote the RCN once again, we urge all health boards to work with us to stop the cuts to staffing levels right across Scotland, and the Scottish Government to plan for the long term and face up to the pressures on our NHS for the people who work in it and the patients who rely on it. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate, and I call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Sarah Boyack. 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to speak in this afternoon's debate in support of the amendment in Alex Neil's name. And I also want to focus my 4 minutes on the health and social care challenges specifically that face Scotland as a society over the longer term, challenges that the Scottish public will look to members of this Parliament to address and to resolve together. And let's be clear, it is a mark of our success as a society that our citizens are living longer and healthier lives. And indeed, by reducing the health inequalities that continue to blight our communities, the Scottish Government is determined to improve the life expectancy for people living in Scotland's most deprived areas. But a rapidly ageing population, as we all know, presents challenges too, especially with more people living with multiple long-term conditions and complex support needs. The Government recognises this, and that's why it is changing the way in which the NHS delivers care, focusing on outcomes, redesigning services around the patient and placing the patient's journey at the centre of everything the NHS does. Today's very welcome announcement of a new bed planning tool also underlines the Government's commitment to ensuring there is the necessary hospital capacity with the right type and number of beds and staff in the right place to support such changes and to help our boards plan their services. But to reduce the demands on the NHS, we need to continue to develop preventative measures, such as the Detect Cancer Early programme, measures that decrease the incidence of avoidable lifestyle-related diseases, such as the decisive action the Government is taking to introduce alcohol minimum unit pricing, which will help both to save lives and to address the pressures that are placed on the NHS through the thousands of hospital admissions and attendance at A&E from alcohol misuse. But also measures that improve the coordination between different elements of our health and social care systems, measures that make it easier for our elderly to continue to live a fulfilling life in their own homes and communities rather than in acute and institutional care, and measures that build capacities at the very local level to provide proper local care and attention to our most vulnerable people. Now, the SNP Government has not only begun the reforms needed to implement these measures, it has already made significant progress in delivering tangible outcomes. But no one is under any delusion of the scale of the challenges that we still face. The direct cuts imposed on the Scottish budget by Westminster, along with the potentially devastating impact of the welfare reforms currently being rolled out by the London Government, are bound to increase the scale of the challenges facing the sustainable delivery of high-quality health and care. But I believe that by protecting the NHS budget, as we are committed to doing for the remainder of the current spending review period, by maintaining our commitment for no compulsory redundancies in the NHS, by investing in our NHS workforce and by protecting the founding principles of the NHS, this Government is taking the appropriate steps to meet these unprecedented challenges. Now, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, this SNP Government is committed to ensuring that the levels of quality and provision of health and social care in our NHS, which the people of Scotland quite rightly expect and deserve into the future, are maintained. And at a time of these unprecedented challenges to our health and care system, I believe, and I think the overwhelming majority of the Scottish public believes, that our hard-working NHS staff and our social care staff are due an immense vote of thanks for their dedication and professionalism. And I also believe that this Government has the support of these health professionals in tackling the challenges ahead in what is a determined and robust manner.
I support the amendment in the Cabinet Secretary's name.
Many thanks. I now call on Sarah Boyack to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate goes to the heart of the challenge, not just of long-term demographic change, but to the short-term challenges that are already facing health boards, those commissioning care services and, crucially, older people and their families who are looking for quality services to support them live quality lives. And I think there's a bit of a reality check needed. We could all see what this amendment was about today, and in fact the Health Secretary's opening speech just demonstrated that in spades. Now, actually, I quite like the Health Secretary's new improved interpretation of his quotation from 2 weeks ago, because actually it sets up what I was going to say perfectly. While Alec Neil says he's against any hospital closures and we don't need to close any beds, in the long term, in terms of the needs of older people in Scotland, if you look at NHS Lothian's strategic clinical framework, it does say otherwise, and there's no getting away with that with respect of older people. It states that less hospital inpatient care may need fewer hospital beds, and those that we do need provided in appropriate and fit-for-purpose accommodation. Now, I want to highlight the massive pressures that we already have in NHS Lothian, and I welcome the extra beds being put in place in the ERI. But at the same time, the Royal Victoria Hospital was closed, a hospital specifically for older people, and it had to be reopened in months because of the short-term capacity problems in the ERI. And there's a question mark over 3 more hospitals, and I don't need to actually go into the quote in depth because that's already been done. But the point here is that it's absolutely vital that before any decisions are taken on those smaller hospitals, that there is a replacement strategy in place, that strategy is funded, that it needs to be clear about the numbers of people that need to be looked after, and that the range of types of care need to be agreed. And actually, that those facilities need to be in place, because that was the lesson of the closure of the Royal Victoria. It's also the lesson of the replacement of the New Sick Kids and the DCN Hospital, because the money hasn't been in place in time to build the facilities. And I don't need to lecture this chamber about the cash-strapped nature of NHS Lothian. That has been well documented. But we do need the Health Secretary to engage with the reality of his funding decisions, because as the BMA have been absolutely clear, the money in real terms is reducing for the health service. So we need guarantees on plans for replacement, and as my MP colleague Ian Murray put it, some of the most frail and vulnerable people in the city need to make sure that the needs of those patients are not necessarily best met in the community setting. We need a proper, honest debate about that now. And the closure, as Jackie Baillie said, of the 5 cairn homes is a timely reminder that it's not just the health element of health and social care. The social care element is a crisis now. There are real problems facing us now. For Edinburgh City Council, there's a particular problem because the 5 cairn homes are very sheltered housing accommodation. They're not financially sustainable according to cairn homes, yet their model of very sheltered housing is precisely the sort of provision that we are going to need more of, not less. Those closure proposals have created understandable distress and worry for the families involved, and as one relative put it, having searched in vain for alternative accommodation, there is nothing that will give elderly, frail people a dignified and independent, with support, way of life. Now, that's precisely the people that Alex Neil was talking about in his opening remarks. The very, very increased numbers of over 75s, many of whom will want to either live in their own homes with support or will need to live in very sheltered accommodation or will need to live in care homes. And there is simply not the funding to go round. I'm told by my colleagues in Edinburgh City that they will need to rebuild or refurbish 8 care homes. They provided a new one in Durham-Bray, but they simply haven't the capital to build, never mind staff a further increase in new care homes. So this is a current problem. It's not a long-term problem, and we need an honest commitment from the Health Secretary, not just to make glib statements at conferences, but to understand the reality on the ground and to act on it.
Many thanks. Now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Bob Doris. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And it was interesting there where Sarah Boyack said that this is a current problem. I would suggest it's a historic problem, and one of the problems that we face in terms of the infrastructure within the health service is that for too many years issues were put on the back burner and we didn't make use of the money in the good times to maybe redevelop some of the facilities, some of the services to the best of the ability that we could have done, we now find ourselves in a situation where there is a resultant backlog and there are those difficulties emerging. So it's a problem from the past that is now affecting us in the here and now. I've only got 4 minutes, I'm afraid, Mr Smith. Were it were a longer debate, we perhaps could have had more time for interventions, but I have a lot I want to get through. And it is always good to be here in the Chamber discussing the health service and its importance. It's disappointing the way that we sometimes find ourselves discussing it, though. But what I want to do is look at some strong local examples and then perhaps focus a little more on the national picture. I think there are two very clear examples of facilities that are being developed currently in Aberdeen, which I think will make a real impact on the way health is delivered locally. Nanette Milne and I both visited the new state-of-the-art emergency care centre in Aberdeen, a £110 million project which is going to improve and enhance the patient experience and should hopefully lead to a reduction in the length of time people are required to be in the care of the health service. That will obviously be of benefit. But also in terms of the gateway facilities that we rely on, there is a project being delivered through hub funding of £4 million for a new Woodside Fountain Health Centre serving the communities of Woodside and Tillydrone. Some of these communities within that area are deprived areas, and therefore that will be a real benefit to them. But the point is that facilities can and do require to change and move with the times in order to adapt to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. In terms of the wider picture of the health of Scotland, I think the first thing to note, and I note the announcement today from the Cabinet Secretary around the bed planning tool for health boards to try and ensure that they plan appropriately for the requirements they will have in the future. I think for too long the short-termism that has dominated not just the way that we do things in politics, but the way we do things in general, has led us not to maybe look at the long-term challenges that are coming up on the horizon and deal with them appropriately. I think that will be of assistance in that. But demographic change goes beyond simply the pressures that there will be on beds within the health service. We're going to see a requirement for more people to act as unpaid carers, for example. And I have experience of that through my mother's experience caring for her mother who had dementia. And more people will be choosing that option rather than the reliance on social care services or the health service to take the caring role. So we need to ensure that the appropriate support is there. That's why it's so important that we have things like the carer strategy, like the dementia strategy, to ensure that we get early diagnosis, early intervention and the most appropriate care and most appropriate support in the most appropriate setting for the individual. Now, if that needs to be through the health service, then we have to ensure the capacity is there. But the preference would always be to have that delivered in the person's own home, giving them that degree of, I'm sorry, I only have 45 seconds left, giving them that degree of personal independence, which would allow them to live as fulfilling a life as possible. And I think the integration argument is the key, because the integration of health and social care is absolutely about closing gaps, breaking down silos and ensuring that where people perhaps in the past, and let's be honest, it will have happened in the past, where people would have found themselves in an acute setting or a hospital setting where they didn't need to be there because there wasn't the joined-up approach being taken by social care and by the health service. The integration agenda is absolutely about breaking that down to ensure those kind of unnecessary hospitalisations do not occur in future. So the health service will always evolve to address needs. We must ensure it is properly resourced and flexible enough to change, and I believe the commitment from the Government to protect the health service budget will enable that, along with some of the measures that are being taken to ensure the flexibility is there as well in future, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now call on Bob Doris, to be followed by Duncan McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At the outset, can I maybe declare an interest? My wife is a nurse in a high dependency unit in Glasgow, and I'm left in no doubt the challenges that NHS staff do face on a daily basis, and the exceptional job they also do in meeting those challenges. But I also know, Presiding Officer, that standing still with Scotland's NHS is simply not an option, not simply because of an increase in an ageing population, but because we should always look for continuous improvement within Scotland's health service. Much of what the NHS has done in the past has been demand-led, a downstream intervention. In other words, it waited until someone was ill and took steps to make them better, or make them as comfortable as possible at least. Increasingly, Scotland's NHS is involved in early intervention and public health initiatives, and it needs to be. That has been a key strategy of the Scottish Government. It is far better to detect illness early
be it with the Scottish Government's Detect Cancer Early initiative, a national example, or local initiatives across Scotland, such as NHS Lanarkshire efforts to detect and treat irregular heart rhythm, which can lead to consequent problems with atrial fibrillation and stroke, and all the demands that then puts in Scotland's NHS as a result, and of course also to meet the health needs of the individuals affected. It's also involved in key public health initiatives such as minimum pricing of alcohol, which can dramatically improve the health of Scots and ease the burden on our NHS. And I think it is worth noting that recent evidence from Canada does show that over a number of years, a 10% increase in alcohol prices has led to a 8.9% decrease in admission to acute services actually within Canada. So a direct public health benefit and health saving. And I think we should be mindful of that when we talk about pressures on Scotland's NHS today. So nothing is standing still. I would like to, but honestly, I don't have time, Ms Bailey. So nothing is standing still in Scotland's NHS, and that means we need to ensure effective planning for both staffing and in terms of bed management. And I think that's where the focus of much of this debate should be. And what I would say is that both Unison and the RCN have been directly involved in helping develop workforce and workload management tools, which will be mandatory in the coming year. And in terms of the recent announcement in terms of a bed management tool, what I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary is that with health and social care integration, I think we have to look to develop any future bed management tool to look to see what the knock-on effects of reconfiguring the bed estate within traditional hospital settings in Scotland may be. In other words, when we move older people out of a traditional hospital setting and we put them in a care home environment or we support them at home, we have to make sure we're monitoring that local authorities have adequate provision and that adequate support services are in place. I think that should be combined in the future as part of an overall bed management tool for where our most needy citizens stay, whether it be in hospital, at home or in a homeless setting within the community. So I would like perhaps more information on that. Can I say that any number, and like any other politician in this chamber, we all become obsessed by numbers. I've deliberately not given the numbers in relation to increases in the health budget, in relation to how we have done very well in terms of staffing numbers, but we can all be obsessed with numbers. But surely to goodness that any number in terms of beds within Scotland's NHS that any individual politician sticks to is an arbitrary number, and what we have to do is get the bed management tool correct to assess properly.
Ms Bailey,
to point out that this is my speech and not yours, if you don't mind.
If you would close your speech, please, Mr Doris.
Assess. Presiding Officer, I was just finishing off, but I was quite rudely interrupted there. If I could just maybe finish off the point I was trying to make, which is any number that's arrived at must be based on evidence, and it must be based on getting this bed management tool right. And had Labour came to the chamber in that positive and constructive vein, we could have an excellent debate this afternoon. But yet again, unfortunately, Labour have just let themselves down on health.
Thanks very much. Now call on Mr Duncan McNeill, and to be followed by Fiona MacLeod. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's been a lot said, I think, about the change in demographic, and it was noticeable that some of my colleagues in the Health Committee all refer to that, as others did, and it must be one of our greatest challenges in terms of the money that we will have, whether it be the current budget or indeed increasing budgets with increasing demand, how we manage that and how we manage that change. What is surprising, though, I think should be noted that we didn't just discover that today. We've had Beveridge, we've had Christie, we've had Lord Sutherland, and we've had 6 years of this government. I recognise, Cabinet Secretary, you have only been in the job 7 months, as you keep telling us, and I don't hold you personally responsible. But there is a challenge, and we all know and should accept that change is difficult for all politicians, but particularly governments who want to win a referendum. It would seem it's even more difficult, and I'm concerned, as I've said to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, that we are dodging hard decisions and building up pressure for the future. We have to deal with the issues that we face. But I think we should judge governments on their action, not by their good intentions. And I know that we would like to get to that, and hopefully you will win your fight in the Cabinet and will be able to address these issues. When we look, as you rightly said, about the people who were delivering these services and seeking this change, I think we should look at, in terms of the comments that they have made, in terms of the strategic approach of the government. The SCVO comment on the change funds, which have been designed to drive change within the care system. They said that we need to see a significant acceleration and spend away from the institutional care. And institutional care also means residential care. They go on to say there is nothing in the current budget structure that would, on the face of it, would serve as a necessary catalyst for that change. If there is concern, indeed, about that, there is also concern from the BMA, who say that a reduction in the e-health funding is also concerning, particularly when we're looking at the integration of health and social care. And we need to be clear that IT investment in that whole process is carried through. And they go on to say that they are very worried that planned integration with IT systems in health and social care will not be achievable. Now, if there is a concern, as I say, about the strategic nature of this, there is also a concern about the limit of funds that are available and how they are being used. The Coalition of Care and Support Providers had this to say on that. The change fund spend on services and activities are questionable in terms of the contribution that they make to the agenda for reshaping care. Age Scotland point out, in support of the Coalition of Care, that the research that they have carried out and the guidance prescribing 20% of those funds, of change funds, to go to carer services in 2012-13, in reality is much less than what was intended. In Aberdeenshire, only £153,000 has been spent in carer services in a budget of £1.9 million. In Angus, we could go on. There is a difference here between the good intentions of government and what we must do. Let's not allow this to continue to drift. We need to address these issues now. It can't wait on an independence referendum.
Thank you very much. I will now move to Fiona MacLeod, after which we'll move to closing speeches. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Much of this debate, of course, is predicated on the future demographics in Scotland, the facts and figures of which we've heard. But I also think it's important that in looking at these demographics, we also have to look at the changes that have happened to healthcare from in the last 20 years, and certainly we will be looking at in the future. These changes are things like medical and technological advances, so that we have much more day surgery and more ACADs. These medical advances also look at the preventative health agenda, where we have things like minimum unit pricing, tobacco control and falls prevention, to ensure that what we're doing now legislatively ensures that we have a healthier population in the future. But we also have to look at the changing expectations of the public in healthcare. And we know from many surveys and research work that's been done over the last, I would say, about 10 years, that increasingly, especially the elderly population, their expectation is that their healthcare, apart from at acute episodes, will be delivered to them at home or in a homely setting. So I would say, and please, Ms Bailey, don't try and intervene as you've been with everybody. You're the party that chose to have a very short debate. I'm 90 seconds into a 4-minute speech. So, in order to have a rational debate, and it would have been better to have a longer debate in order to actually produce more facts and figures, but in order to have a rational debate, this isn't entirely about bed counting. This isn't about numbers of nurses on wards, but this is about what the Scottish Government is doing. It's about the redesign of the health service. It's about forward planning for the health service, and it's about 21st century delivery of healthcare. And the Scottish Government is already doing that. In terms of funding, we have protected funding to the NHS and increasingly looking at moving from capital to revenue, because that's where we need the services. We're looking at the integration of health and social care so that we ensure that especially the elderly population actually get all their care needs met in one package. And I've also already talked about the preventative health agenda. Okay. I wanted to introduce some evidence into this debate, and I will, if I can, quickly talk about North Lanarkshire's Hospital at Home project, and where they found that 80% under the Hospital at Home project, 80% of elderly people stayed at home rather than being admitted to hospital. The NHS Forth Valley Reablement Service found that there was a 20% reduction in care needs, a 35% reduction in falls, and crucially, there was a need for 58 fewer long-term care beds. And I think Ms Bailey's talk about the numbers of beds has to be viewed with that background. It's numbers in the round, not numbers in the raw, Ms Bailey. And Foot and Stanners found in 2002 that 20 to 30% of those aged over 75 who were admitted on an acute occasion, it was an inappropriate admission, as I think Mark MacDonald referred to. But not only were they inappropriate admissions, they were admissions that resulted in longer stay in hospital. So what I don't understand from this is Jackie Bailey obviously gets what we're talking about here, about the change in the kind of beds we need. You made it yourself in your intervention on the closure of Lennox Castle, although you forgot to mention that you shut Stobhill Hill Hospital. But Sarah Boyack also got it when she talked about the need for care home building. If we need beds in care homes, that's the future. So can I just finish by saying that the Cabinet Secretary has got it right. We need the health professionals and we need the delivery, but it will be in different places with a different emphasis. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we now move to winding up speeches. Now call on Jackson Carlaw. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. You know, a great deal has been made in this debate, and it was the centrepiece of Ms Bailey's motion of the quotation from the Cabinet Secretary in his speech to Unison. Now, we know that Lothian decided not to take what the Cabinet Secretary said seriously, and I wasn't sure that we were meant to either, because I read the rest of his speech. And he then went on to say that he was offering to franchise himself and Alex Salmon out to run England and Wales. And I thought that perhaps Ms Bailey and I might contact our respective members of Parliament representing England and Wales to see what they made of that offer. I know that Scotland would only rejoice if the Cabinet Secretary could persuade the First Minister to concentrate on the day job he has, which is actually to be running Scotland. He then went on to say, we will not be privatising, this is very Alec Neil, by the back door, by the front door, by the side door, or by any other door. We will not be privatising the health service in Scotland. Well, his amendment this afternoon was a trapdoor to escape from the substance of the debate in hand, because I stood up to sum up on the Cabinet Secretary's contribution on his amendment. The only person to mention minimum pricing, other than a cursory reference from one lone SNP backbencher, Bob Doris, was Jackie Bailey. There was nothing on alcohol minimum unit pricing. Now, I think there should be. It's now a year since the legislation was passed, and we don't have it. And I do think the Government owe it to this Parliament to come back to tell us what the status of alcohol minimum unit pricing is. We asked that it would be... Now, you didn't wish to speak to it in your own speech, Mr MacDonald. It's a bit late in the day to try and speak to it in mine. It was, after all, your side's amendment. We supported alcohol minimum unit pricing on this side. We believed it should be given an opportunity to succeed. We asked that it be notified to the European Union to find out what its legal status was. The Government responded at the end of December to the queries of the European Union. We know the Cabinet Secretary has been in discussions with the European Union, but we also know that there is a dissolution of the European Parliament less time away now than since it was that we passed the legislation in the past. Is this bill simply going to go nowhere? As a UK government, we supported the SNP in the challenge that was made by the Scotch Whisky Association in the Court of Session, a resolution of which we had last week and which the UK government were working on before finalising their own plans. And I must say to the Scotch Whisky Association what I hope the Cabinet Secretary might have said this afternoon, that I wish they would respect that judgment and now present no further obstacle in the way of the implementation of alcohol minimum unit pricing being given its chance to succeed. Well, I mean, Mr Paterson is interjecting from the back benches. This was the substance of the government's amendment, and nobody from the government had anything to say about it. Now, I come to the subject of the debate, and I thought Miss Bailey was being a bit disingenuous, because in all the years I have sat in this Parliament, her colleague Mr Simpson has repeatedly said that bed numbers don't matter, that they aren't actually the yardstick by which anything should be judged. And the important point is surely the one that we spent a whole afternoon debating. This is not an argument between both sides as to who's cut more beds or when. The honest debate Mr Bailey was calling for, which I simply believe and have said before we all need to have, is recognising the point the Cabinet Secretary made, that we have a hugely ageing demographic. And I think what the Cabinet Secretary was trying to suggest is that unless we are successful on the preventative agenda, unless we are successful in finding out which processes and treatments in the NHS we currently are undertaking which are no longer sustainable or can be done in other ways, then we simply aren't going to have the money to meet the ageing demographic population challenge, and that we need to get smart and efficient in the NHS, not to cut the funding of it, but to ensure that we are able to meet the challenge that that ageing demographic is going to present. We will work with the Cabinet Secretary on every occasion if that's the case, and I look forward to the Minister offering me the reassurance on alcohol minimum pricing I thought his amendment was going to afford him the opportunity to do.
Minister Michael Matheson, now 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's fair to say, although it's been a short health debate, there are no health debates take place in this Parliament now where proper recognition is not given to the challenge which is being created by the demographic shift that's taking place in the country. And I think we are all at one in recognising the challenges that that creates, not only for our health service, but for a range of our public services that have to respond to the demands and needs that come from an ageing population, which is to be celebrated in itself, given that people are living longer, healthier lives. And I want to pick up on what I recognise, like the Cabinet Secretary outlined in his remarks, about the twin challenges which we face in our NHS and social care system going forward, created by that demographic shift of an ageing population and the lifestyle choices that can impact on our health system. Now, Jackie Bailey and Annette Millen, in their own contributions, as others have made, and Jackson Carlow just made the same reference, recognise the challenges created through our ageing population. But the biggest challenge that creates for us is how we configure our NHS and our social care system in the future which can actually meet that demand. And I don't think anybody in this chamber is reasonably arguing that change is just not an option. Change is required, even with an increasing budget, even if we lived in the land that Labour believe in, with the money tree in the corner that can provide for everything. We would still have to change our system in a way we still have to change our system in a way that allows us to meet that ever-increasing demand that's been placed upon it. And if we are to do that, we have to do it in a way that allows us to address what Annette Millen referred to as that huge train that is speeding its way towards our health service in order to meet that particular challenge. I'll give way to Jackie Bailey.
Jackie Bailey.
I absolutely agree with much of what he says, but therefore I'm at a loss. Does he agree with his own Cabinet Secretary when he said we would need the same number of hospitals?
The problem I always have with Labour debates is that very often there is a nice orderly queue of Labour backbenchers that line up in the debate asking for money for X, Y and Z, and at no point do they give any contribution as to how you should configure services in order to meet the challenge and where that particular resource will actually come from. But I want to make some progress, because in meeting that challenge, there are some key measures that need to be taken forward. Key measures. And that's about getting the balance between our acute and our primary care services right, about the balance between our health and social care support, and also making sure we've got the right skills mix within our NHS staff and within our social care staff, both at the acute end and also at the primary care end, in order to address that. And in taking all of these particular measures forward, we have got to make sure we do so in a way that is anticipatory and also addresses the prevention agenda. Let me just pick up on a couple of examples of that, because some of the challenges we've had in our NHS through unscheduled admissions to our NHS come about at times because of what can be inadequate planning and services being in place in order to prevent the need for someone to be admitted to hospital. But it's also about how we deploy our NHS staff in order to meet that challenge. So, for example, we know that if we put AHP staff within our A&E departments, it can reduce the potential for older people to be admitted to hospital at any particular given time for certain conditions. And what we need to do is, where we've had examples of that happening in one part of our NHS, is to make sure that it's happening across the rest of the NHS. But the biggest change that's coming, and I believe the biggest change in a generation that's coming to our NHS and to our social care system, is through the integration of health and social care. And although Jackie Bailey mentioned the culture and she made reference to finance, I don't actually think that's the real cultural challenge which will come out from the changes in integration of health and social care. The real cultural challenge will come from the different professional viewpoints on how services are provided. Not about whether you're financially assessed for that or whether you're financially assessed for one other thing. It's a cultural difference between the professionals that I think will be the real challenge in making sure that it works effectively. And one of the opportunities that integration provides us through joint commissioning is to allow us to make sure that we are much more targeted and focused in bringing these services together with a clear focus on what the long-term outcome is as well. But it's also important that when we consider how we configure our NHS, that we also look downstream to some of the things that do cause challenges within our NHS. And no one would dispute that both alcohol and tobacco continue to cause major public health challenges which contribute to the pressures on our NHS. And yes, minimum unit pricing is an important measure that I believe can actually help to address this issue. And I was delighted that only yesterday the EU Commissioner for Health, Commissioner Borg, when he told the European Parliament's Health Committee, and I quote, that all the studies of which I am informed of regarding measures to control either tobacco or alcohol have shown that the measure which are most effective are the fiscal ones. That's why minimum unit pricing is an important part to play in dealing with some of the challenge we have through alcohol. And yes, the bill continues to be challenged by the Scottish Whisky Association. We have to wait for that legal process to be completed, just as was the case when it came to the tobacco display ban as well. And we'll have to wait until that particular process has been completed. But equally on tobacco, we have some 13,000 deaths a year, over 56,000 people admitted because of tobacco use each year. These are challenges which we have to address if we are to make sure we get the balance right in taking forward our NHS and our social care system to make sure it's fit to meet the challenges it faces in the years to come.
Many thanks. Now call on Drew Smith to wind up the debate. You have 8 minutes, Mr Smith, please.
Well, Presiding Officer, this has been an interesting debate. Despite the pressures facing the NHS in Scotland, though, we have managed to come together and again make clear that we remain proud of our service and particularly of all our hard-working NHS staff. NHS staff are at the front line of delivering a service which is responsive to the needs of patients and which prioritises quality as well as efficiency. When the Unison National Health Conference met in Glasgow 2 weeks ago, I was delighted to attend and welcome delegates to my city and to Scotland, and the discussions I had with visitors and local Unison activists alike did reflect that in Scotland we have, under successive Scottish governments, chosen a different path for our NHS. But alongside consensus, there is a need for honesty. Delegates who work in Scotland's hospitals were not quiet about the challenges they are facing in the service that we are all responsible for right now. Nationally, the Auditor-General has described a service on amber warning, while at local level, frontline NHS staff describe the reality of working on a ward with too few nurses. When the standard of care suffers, no one is more frustrated by this than hospital staff. Health Board managers also know that the financial and staffing pressures are having an impact on the ground. Each of us will be contacted regularly by constituents about the service that they are getting. That's why Labour have sought to confront the politics of this place with the real-life picture of what is actually happening in the wards of our hospitals right now. We should be honest about both the funding and the staffing pressures which the service is facing, as well as about the demographic challenge which we face. The Cabinet Secretary has talked about the latter before, and so have we. Health and social care integration is partly a response to our shared view that the current set-up won't work into the future. And a number of members this afternoon have pointed out that bed numbers alone should not be our only guide. The NHS exists to help people get better if they are sick and to help those with longer-term conditions, and all of us, as we get older, to live our lives as fully as we can. None of us would want to see anyone in a hospital if their admission could be prevented or lying in a hospital bed for any longer than they need to be. That point has been made consistently by this side, both in opposition and when we were in government. There is then a contrast, isn't there, with the words which have been quoted this afternoon of Nicola Sturgeon, who, when she was in opposition, said cutting bed numbers has been going on for far too long. In the Scotsman of 8 July 2006, she said we should be increasing the number of acute staff beds to the benefit of the patients of Scotland. The reality then, 6.5 years later, in 2007, the average number of available staff beds was 17,505. Remember, this was after bed cuts had, according to the SNP, been going on for, quote, far too long. In December 2012, average available staff beds, 16,085. So while Nicola Sturgeon said we should be increasing the number of acute staff beds to the benefit of the patients of Scotland, what she actually did was reduce the number of beds available by 1,420. At the Unison Health Conference, Alec Neil decided to revisit the issue of bed numbers. Perhaps he wanted to clarify the Scottish Government's position. Perhaps he thought it was time for an update. And it was the Cabinet Secretary who said, for the benefit of Fiona MacLeod and Bob Doris and others, it wasn't Jackie Baillie who said, it was the Cabinet Secretary who said, we are still going to need the same number of beds, the same number of hospitals, the same number of doctors and nurses, just to stand still. That is the direct quote that the Scottish Government have argued should be deleted from today's motion and replaced with a reference to minimum pricing. Minimum honesty might have been a better bet from the Scottish Government this afternoon. Standing still is also a term that perhaps requires some further definition, because since 2009, the current Scottish Government has cut almost 2,000 nursing and midwifery staff, student nursing numbers /2. The number of nursing and midwifery staff is now lower than when the SNP came to power. Far from standing still, an awful lot of nurses seem to have managed to find their way out of the door. So on bed numbers and staffing, we seem to have a problem between what is said in public about our hospitals and what is actually happening in our hospitals. And on hospitals, Sarah Boyack was absolutely right to point out that at the same time as his comments to Unison about bed numbers and staffing, the Cabinet Secretary also asserted that changing demographics, more older people, means maintaining, quote, the same numbers of hospitals. Again, a very clear commitment from the Scottish Government, and given the Cabinet Secretary's interest in hospital campaigns, it was a guarantee that I am sure he was pleased to give. It therefore does remain rather unfortunate that at the same time that Mr Neil was talking to Unison in Glasgow, here in Edinburgh, NHS Lothian were confirming they were actually looking at closing not one, not two, but 3 hospitals. Asked about this apparent inconsistency, a spokesperson for the Scottish Government said, we are committed to at least maintaining the level of quality and provision in Scotland's NHS, and that means having the right numbers of staff and beds. So in 2006, the SNP claimed NHS Scotland needed to increase bed numbers. By 2012, they'd actually cut them. 2 weeks ago, Alec Neil was promising Unison activists to keep the numbers the same. By the day after, they wanted to talk about finding the right number. And today, they're asking the Parliament to delete all references to numbers at all. And instead, we should have talked about minimum pricing. Except we didn't. So we'll have to come back to that one another day. Since the Cabinet Secretary came to this role, we've had a scandal over the SNP's hidden waiting list. We've had attempts to change the 4-hour A&E waiting time target. That's the same target that's not been met across Scotland for 3 years. As Jackie Baillie said, Scottish Labour are happy to debate all of those issues and indeed minimum pricing with the Scottish Government any day of the week. It would, though, make for a more honest debate if comments made outside this chamber in 1 week were a bit more similar to the comments made in the chamber a few weeks later. When the Cabinet Secretary was speaking to Unison, he was addressing workers who day and daily cope on the front line. When our constituents come to our surgeries or telephone our offices, they are telling us of a service under pressure. When the Auditor-General says the NHS is on an amber warning, and when the comments made by ministers fail to reflect the situation on the ground, it is our duty in this Parliament to pause and think about whether we want to have a debate where the rhetoric reflects reality rather than obscures it. The Cabinet Secretary simply asserts beds, staff, hospitals all need to stay the same. Yet at the same time, Lothian confirm they want to close 3. Their most recent board papers say the overall number of doctors will decrease. NHS Western Isles are currently proposing a cut from 89 beds to just 53, while in my own health board, Glasgow, I know that they are conducting an acute services review. So none of this squares with the Cabinet Secretary's comments to Unison, but it does square with the Government's amendment today. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, if the civil servants got to Alec Neil after his comments today, they also got to all of his backbenchers, not one of whom was prepared to defend his comments of last week. So can I simply say this? On the number of hospitals, the number of beds in those hospitals and the number of staff around a bedside, it would do the Scottish Government well to remember the purpose of that bed, to provide a warm and safe place for treatment of someone in need. Let's pay those people the respect they deserve by taking their experiences seriously and being honest about how we respond to the challenges that we all know caring for them presents. I urge Parliament to support the motion in Jackie Bailey's name and to reject Mr Neil's amendment, even though it did serve the purpose of clarifying that when he told Unison that all nurses, doctors, beds and hospitals would stay the same, he didn't really mean it.
Thank you. That concludes debate on motion number S4M 06474 on Scotland's Health Service. Before we come to decision time, I have something that I wish to say. During portfolio questions today, a member, while putting a question to the Government, carried out a stunt by holding up a newspaper. The newspaper clearly had advance notice of the member's intention, as it had a photographer in the gallery to capture the moment. This is discourteous to the Parliament and to the Cabinet Secretary who was answering the question. It appeared that the parliamentary proceedings were secondary to the potential for good coverage in a local newspaper. This is not the first time that a similar stunt has been staged. I acknowledge that the member concerned subsequently apologised to me and to give an assurance that there would be no repeat, but let me make clear to the whole of the chamber that such blatant stunts are a matter of discourtesy and disrespect to other members and to the Parliament as a whole. The next item of business is consideration of business motion S4M 06478 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion S4M 06478.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number S4M 06478 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number S4M 06475.1 in the name of Aileen Campbell, which seeks to amend motion number S4M 06475 in the name of Hugh Henry on childcare be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6475.1 in the name of Aileen Campbell is as follows. Yes, 63. No, 54. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number S4M 06475 in the name of Hugh Henry as amended on childcare be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result on the vote on motion number 6475 in the name of Hugh Henry as amended is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 52. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number S4M 06474.1 in the name of Alex Neil, which seeks to amend motion number S4M 06474 in the name of Jackie Bailey on Scotland's Health Service be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6474.1 in the name of Alex Neil is as follows. Yes, 77. No, 40. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The fourth question is that motion number S4M 06474 in the name of Jackie Bailey as amended on Scotland's Health Service be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 6474 in the name of Jackie Bailey as amended is as follows. Yes, 84. No, 0. There were 32 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We will now move on to members' business. Members who leave in the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.